In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. On paper, it looked like a routine military intervention, another Cold War power stepping in to stabilize a collapsing communist ally. But what unfolded would become one of the most expensive, far-reaching, and dangerous covert operations in American history. It had no official name on the news. No American soldiers marched through Afghan valleys. There were no headlines, no medals, and no speeches. But behind closed doors, billions of dollars were funneled into a hidden a war run by spies, carried out by proxies, and funded with the single goal of weakening the Soviet Union. The mission: arm local Afghan fighters, the mujahedeen, and turn Afghanistan into a graveyard for the Red Army. It worked, but the true cost wouldn't be seen for decades, because in trying to destroy one enemy, the United States empowered another, one that would return with fire and fury on American soil. This is the story of Operation Cyclone, America's longest and deadliest secret war. If you're into hidden history and want to explore the real stories behind the headlines, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. There's a lot more coming your way. In April 1978, a coup overthrew Afghanistan's government. A new communist regime, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, took power with Soviet support. Almost overnight, a deeply conservative tribal society was being force-fed Marxist reforms. Land redistribution, the banning of child marriage, forced literacy campaigns. What might have seemed like progress to Western eyes was chaos to Afghan villagers. Rebellion flared almost immediately. By late 1979, the Afghan government was collapsing under its own weight. Facing mutiny within the military and growing resistance in the countryside, it asked the Soviet Union for direct military help. On December 24, 1979, the Soviets answered. Over 100,000 troops flooded into Afghanistan, propping up a failing regime with tanks, helicopters, and brute force. They assassinated the Afghan president and installed their own puppet in his place. The invasion shocked the world, but in Washington, it triggered something more than outrage. In the quiet rooms of the White House and CIA headquarters, another kind of war was already being planned. President Jimmy Carter, deeply concerned about Soviet expansion, signed a secret directive. The U.S. would begin supplying aid to anti-Soviet fighters in Afghanistan. It was a small step, a few $1,000,000, mostly non-lethal support, radios, medical kits, propaganda. But inside the CIA, a plan was already forming. They didn't just want to support resistance, they wanted to weaponize it. The agency saw Afghanistan as an opportunity, a Soviet quagmire in the making, and they knew how to exploit it. The idea wasn't to save Afghanistan. The idea was to make the Soviets bleed. The more troops they poured in, the deeper they'd sink. And the deeper they sank, the more it would cost them. This would become the foundation for one of the largest covert operations in U.S. history. One that would outlast Carter, outgrow its original scale, and ultimately reshape the global balance of power. It started with one directive, but it was about to escalate far beyond anyone's imagination. When Ronald Reagan took office in January 1981, the Cold War wasn't just a geopolitical rivalry, it was a moral crusade. Reagan didn't want containment. He wanted victory, and nowhere did that desire burn hotter than in Afghanistan. To Reagan and his inner circle, the Soviet invasion wasn't just imperialism, it was proof of communist aggression, and Afghanistan wasn't just a battlefield. It was the chance to turn the tables. The logic was simple. If the Soviets could bleed the United States in Vietnam, then the U.S. could bleed the Soviets in Afghanistan. Under Reagan, Operation Cyclone exploded in scale. The CIA's budget for the Afghan war skyrocketed from just over $20 million in 1980 to over $600 million per year by the mid-80s. This wasn't just humanitarian support anymore. It was hard weapons, sabotage training, guerrilla tactics, and heavy-duty supplies. But the CIA didn't deliver weapons directly to Afghan fighters. That would make American involvement too obvious. Instead, the agency worked through a proxy, Pakistan's Inter Services Intelligence, or ISI. Pakistan became the middleman. The CIA gave them money and weapons. The ISI decided which Afghan factions received them. This arrangement gave the U.S. plausible deniability, but it also handed incredible power to Pakistan, which had its own agenda. The ISI didn't care about democracy or moderation. It backed groups that were ideologically extreme, but fiercely loyal. Fighters like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, a brutal Islamist warlord who would later fire rockets into Kabul and attack his own allies. Still, for Reagan's team, these were acceptable risks. The priority was simple: drive up the cost of the Soviet occupation. Make every road dangerous, every patrol risky, every helicopter vulnerable. By 1984, the CIA was not only supplying AK-47s and RPGs, but also engineering explosives, sabotage guides, and later, Stinger missiles, shoulder-fired weapons capable of taking down Soviet aircraft with devastating precision. The CIA even built training camps along the Afghan-Pakistani border, many run by Pakistan with American oversight. Thousands of fighters were trained in small unit tactics, demolitions, and hit-and-run warfare. Others were radicalized, seeing their mission not just as national defense, but holy war. For the Americans, the immediate results were encouraging. Soviet convoys were getting ambushed. Helicopters were falling from the sky. Moscow was bleeding. But underneath the success, a dangerous undercurrent was forming. The U.S. wasn't just arming a resistance, it was fueling a generation of militant ideologues, battle-hardened and trained to fight superpowers. A decade later, some of those same fighters would be shooting at Americans. By the mid-1980s, the U.S. was pumping hundreds of millions of dollars into Afghanistan's anti-Soviet insurgency. Weapons flowed in by the truckload. Training camps multiplied. Guerrilla war was being waged on a scale the Soviets hadn't anticipated. From a tactical standpoint, Operation Cyclone was working, but politically and ideologically, it was becoming increasingly dangerous. The U.S. didn't have direct relationships with Afghan commanders. That was by design. Everything flowed through Pakistan's ISI, a powerful intelligence agency that had little interest in democracy or moderation. Their primary goal was influence, and they saw Afghanistan's future not as a pluralist state, but as a client Islamist regime under their control. That meant the lion's share of CIA weapons and funding went not to moderate nationalists or tribal leaders, but to the most extreme and hardline Islamist factions. Chief among them was Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, a brutal warlord known for targeting civilians, attacking rival factions, and embracing a fundamentalist vision of Islamic rule. Hekmatyar wasn't just a fighter, he was a zealot, and yet he became one of the largest recipients of American aid. Other recipients included radical madrasa-trained fighters based in Pakistan, where U.S.-supplied weapons were handed out in coordination with clerics preaching jihad. The idea of the war as a holy struggle, a religious duty, began to dominate the narrative among many mujahedeen groups. It was a subtle but devastating shift. What had started as a nationalist resistance against a foreign occupier was now being infused with a global, religious ideology, one that would outlast the Soviets. The CIA, focused narrowly on fighting the USSR, largely ignored the long-term implications. As long as Soviet helicopters were falling and convoys were being destroyed, the mission was considered a success. Concerns about extremism were dismissed as secondary. Meanwhile, thousands of foreign fighters, mostly from Arab countries, began flooding into the region. They saw the war not just as an Afghan cause, but as a global jihad. Among them was a young, wealthy Saudi named Osama bin Laden. Though not directly funded by the U.S., he benefited from the network, the infrastructure, and the chaos that Operation Cyclone helped create. By empowering these fighters, the U.S. and its allies weren't just destabilizing Soviet control. They were building the foundation for a new kind of war, one that wouldn't be fought between nations, but against networks of ideologically driven militants. And once the Soviets left, those fighters wouldn't go home. They'd look for the next enemy. By 1986, the Soviet campaign in Afghanistan was unraveling. What was supposed to be a swift intervention had turned into a bloody, grinding quagmire. Convoys were ambushed daily. Helicopters were shot out of the sky by American-supplied Stinger missiles. Soviet soldiers were dying in the mountains. Not in glorious battle, but in small, demoralizing skirmishes against invisible enemies. The Soviets had tried everything. Scorched earth tactics, mass arrests, and chemical weapons. But for every village they destroyed, a dozen more turned against them. For every airstrike they launched, the resistance grew bolder. By now, Operation Cyclone had turned Afghanistan into a war zone, armed to the teeth. CIA money had reached even the most remote corners of the country. Insurgents had radios, satellite intel, and advanced weaponry, and they were using it with ruthless precision. Inside the Kremlin, pressure was mounting. The war had become politically toxic. Mothers protested in the streets, demanding to know why their sons were dying in a foreign land. The Soviet economy, already faltering, was buckling under the cost. Morale inside the Red Army was collapsing. In 1988, under the new leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviets announced their intent to withdraw. It wasn't surrender, they claimed. It was a strategic decision. But no one was fooled. This was a defeat. On February 15, 1989, the last Soviet soldier crossed the Amudarya River, leaving Afghanistan behind. The war had lasted nearly a decade. It killed over 15,000 Soviet troops, injured tens of thousands more, and left a generation traumatized. To the U.S. intelligence community, this was a Cold War triumph. A communist superpower had been driven out by ragtag guerrillas, armed and backed by America. It was a strategic and symbolic victory, but there was no victory parade, no diplomatic follow-up, no rebuilding effort. The mission had been to weaken the Soviets, not to help Afghanistan. And so, as the last Soviet tanks rolled away, they left behind a nation in ruins and an arsenal of weapons in the hands of warlords, extremists, and foreign fighters with unfinished agendas. The Soviets were gone, but the real chaos was just beginning. The Soviet army may have withdrawn, but the war in Afghanistan was far from over. With no common enemy to unite them, the Afghan mujahedeen factions turned on each other almost immediately. What followed was not peace, but a brutal civil war. Kabul, the capital, became a battlefield. Former allies shelled the city indiscriminately. Rival warlords carved up territory. Civilians were caught in the crossfire. Between 1992 and 1996, more Afghans died at the hands of fellow Afghans than during the entire Soviet occupation. The United States, meanwhile, had already moved on. With the Cold War winding down and the Soviet Union collapsing in 1991, Operation Cyclone was quietly shut down. The billions in funding dried up. The covert networks were abandoned. There was no Marshall Plan for Afghanistan, no peacekeeping force, no political roadmap. The country was left to disintegrate, and in the chaos, a new force began to rise. In 1994, a group of Islamic students and former fighters calling themselves the Taliban emerged from the south. They promised order, religious purity, and an end to the warlordism that had torn the country apart. Backed by Pakistan's ISI and armed with leftover U.S. and Soviet weapons, they swept through the country. By 1996, the Taliban had seized Kabul and established an Islamic emirate. Their rule was harsh, repressive, and absolute. Public executions, banned education for girls, and the complete erasure of women from public life became law. But perhaps more dangerously, the Taliban offered sanctuary. Among those welcomed into Afghanistan was Osama bin Laden, a veteran of the anti-Soviet jihad who had built a new organization, Al-Qaeda. From the mountains of Afghanistan, bin Laden trained fighters, plotted attacks, and declared war on the West. None of this happened overnight. It was the result of a slow, steady collapse, a vacuum of power flooded with weapons and ideology that had been created over the course of a decade. Operation Cyclone had succeeded in driving the Soviets out, but by abandoning Afghanistan afterward, the U.S. had left behind something far worse: a failed state, a rising theocracy, and the seeds of a global insurgency. Afghanistan had gone from Cold War battlefield to the front line of a new, unpredictable war, one the world was not prepared to fight. In the years following the Taliban's rise, the West paid little attention to Afghanistan. It was a poor, broken country with no strategic value, or so it seemed. But deep in its mountains, something far more dangerous was taking root. Osama bin Laden, once a little-known Saudi millionaire, who had funded Arab fighters during the anti-Soviet war, was now using Afghanistan as a base of operations. From there, he built Al-Qaeda, a global jihadist network inspired by the same ideology the CIA had once tolerated, if not encouraged. Bin Laden had learned a powerful lesson from the Soviet war. With enough willpower, propaganda, and guerrilla tactics, even a superpower could be defeated. Now his sights were set on a new enemy, the United States. Throughout the 1990s, Al-Qaeda struck multiple U.S. targets. The 1998 embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania, the attack on the USS Cole in 2000, but none of these prompted a full response. The group grew more emboldened. And in the shadows, bin Laden was preparing for something far larger. On September 11, 2001, the world saw the consequences of that preparation. 4 American airliners were hijacked by Al-Qaeda operatives. 2 were flown into the World Trade Center. 1 hit the Pentagon. The 4th crashed in Pennsylvania after passengers fought back. Nearly 3,000 people were killed, the deadliest terrorist attack in modern history. In the days that followed, the United States began asking hard questions. How had this happened? Where had these men trained? Who had given them shelter? All roads led back to Afghanistan. The Taliban, now in full control of the country, refused to hand over bin Laden. And so, the U.S. invaded, launching Operation Enduring Freedom. The war was framed as a fight against terrorism, but its roots stretched back decades to the arms shipments, the training camps, and the radical networks born during Operation Cyclone. This was the blowback the CIA had feared but never truly planned for. In trying to use Islamic extremism as a Cold War weapon, the U.S. had helped nurture a global threat it could no longer contain. The tragedy of Operation Cyclone wasn't just in the chaos it left behind, it was in the fact that it worked. The Soviets were driven out. The Cold War tilted in America's favor. But the cost? A generation of radicalized fighters, a safe haven for terrorism, and a war that would drag the U.S. back into Afghanistan. This time with its own soldiers in the crosshairs. Operation Cyclone stands as one of the most ambitious and consequential covert operations in American history. It achieved what it set out to do. The Soviet Union was bled in a war it could not win. Its defeat in Afghanistan contributed directly to the unraveling of Soviet influence and, within a few years, the collapse of the USSR itself. From a Cold War strategist's perspective, it was a victory. Clean, efficient, and bloodless, at least for American forces. But the deeper legacy is far more complex. The U.S. had backed fighters it didn't fully understand, in a land it barely studied, with long-term consequences it never prepared for. In its obsession with defeating Moscow, Washington had helped build an ecosystem of radicalization. It had legitimized the use of extremist ideology as a political weapon, and in doing so, created a self-sustaining engine of violence. The irony is inescapable. The very men who once used U.S. weapons to destroy Soviet tanks would later raise those same weapons against American soldiers and civilians. The training camps built to resist communism became launch pads for global terrorism. Operation Cyclone wasn't just a war in the shadows. It was a lesson in the danger of short-sighted foreign policy. Tactical success does not equal strategic wisdom. Winning the battle does not always mean winning the future. The operation is rarely discussed today, buried beneath more recent conflicts, but its fingerprints are everywhere. In the ruins of Kabul, the rise of the Taliban, the architecture of Al-Qaeda, and the unending cycle of intervention and insurgency that has defined U.S. policy ever since. In trying to destroy one enemy, America empowered another, one far more elusive, more committed, and more permanent. The story of Operation Cyclone isn't just history, it's a warning, a reminder that even the most calculated strategies can spiral beyond control, that short-term wins can breed long-term consequences, and that in the shadows of foreign policy, the cost of success is often paid in unforeseen ways. If this is the kind of history you think more people should know, the stories behind the stories, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others. Because sometimes the most important wars are the ones no one was ever supposed to hear about. The story of Operation Cyclone is more than a Cold War footnote. It's a case study in unintended consequences, how a secret war meant to bring down an empire helped give rise to a new kind of enemy. Thank you for watching and for taking the time to explore this hidden chapter of history. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it. It helps more than you know, and it ensures these forgotten stories aren't lost to time. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay sharp.